The 7800 is back on NES Works Gaiden, episode 68. Come pet the cat.
50-year-old record for rescuing insolvent savings and loan associations, not since 1938 when the government bailed out 277 thrifts has there been anything like this year's record.
In case you haven't yet quite cottoned to my intentions for this channel, I'm currently in the process of building up the NES Works family of videos to the advent of 16-bit video game systems in America. That's why I've spent so much time on Master System recently, because a big part of that system's life in the US ran in parallel to its sibling, the Sega Genesis. So it's time for me to get things back on track with the 7800, since Atari has a horse in 1989's next-gen race on the handheld side. Yes, I'm talking about the Atari Lynx, a system that humbled the Game Boy, at least technically. You can check out the Game Boy Works Gaiden videos I've put together through the end of 1990 to catch up on Lynx's story and why it utterly cratered at retail, while the Game Boy's crappy screen and low-powered processor ascended to the heavens. Lynx's troubles didn't simply stem from its sticker price and power consumption, crucial as those factors proved to be in the handheld console race. Sega's Game Gear presented similar power and a similar hunger for batteries to the Lynx, but it did pretty damn well for itself, even before ancient squished 16-bit mega hit Sonic the Hedgehog down into its cramped resolution. No, the Lynx left the starting blocks hobbled by a disadvantage that Nintendo and Sega's machines lacked, namely Atari. That's relevant to this episode because neither of the 7800 releases here presents Atari in a particularly great light, and why should they? The Atari of the 7800 era was not the Atari Inc. of the 2600's heyday. Lynx and 7800 came to us from Atari Corp., a parasite of an entity wearing the skin of a beloved game maker. The Atari that everyone loved soldiered on in arcades as Atari Games, and delivered one kick-ass coin-op experience after the next. This Atari, Atari Corp., was basically a holding company through which Jack Tramiel acquired a lot of property rights and a few warehouses full of old Atari Inc. stock to sell after he was ousted from Commodore. In researching this episode, one fact asserted itself time and again. Jack Tramiel did not want to be in the video games business. In fact, it kind of seemed like he genuinely hated it. But he had inherited a ton of video game merchandise that he needed to offload, so he did, albeit unenthusiastically. And he couldn't really rely on enthusiastic third-party partners to make up the shortfall caused by his video game antipathy and apathy, because he allegedly didn't see the other companies that Atari worked with as partners. He saw them as targets, as potential victims to be leveraged and exploited. We saw that with Lynx, which Epyx created and Atari took control of by basically running Epyx out of business. But it also happened with distributors and other small companies that existed in the Atari ecosystem. Now, God knows that Nintendo certainly was no paragon of virtue when it came to their treatment of licensees, and Sega took a while to come around to the whole idea of letting other people put games on their consoles. But both of those companies still presented a compelling business case for other publishers due to their platform's reach, marketing, and profitability. Atari Corp did not offer any of those things in the latter 80s, and by all accounts, Tramiel and his executive team actively discouraged other companies from working with them. All of this is internet hearsay, of course, but when enough people claim to share first-hand accounts of shenanigans, you start to lend credence to the pattern that emerges. Certainly this could go a long way toward explaining what happened with the two games we're about to dig into. This episode brings us two of the most infamous releases for Atari 7800, beginning here with Tank Command by Froggo Games. Tank Command is infamous for two reasons, really. One, it's by far the rarest and most expensive game for 7800, and two, it's by, well, Froggo Games. You can certainly understand what makes Tank Command so rare. It's not good. It feels like a half-finished project that someone shipped without bothering to playtest even once. Now, the quality of the 7800's library was much higher on average than that of the 2600. Then again, the system only had about 50 games total versus the 500 or so that shipped for 2600 before its official retirement, so there were literally only about a tenth of the opportunities for true garbage to make its way out the door as on the older machine. So it was brave of Froggo Games to bring 2600-style junk to the 7800. Fundamentally, Tank Command has a perfectly coherent premise, which the title gives away. It wants to be SNK's TNK3 or Iron Tank, and Capcom's Commando. And hey, fair enough, both of those were pretty solid arcade hits that showed up on NES. And a successful blend of the two would have given the 7800 a compelling equal to the competition. A real boon for 7800 owners who wanted a taste of the NES experience on their own machines. This ain't it. Tank Command has its heart in the right place, I think, putting players in command of a battle tank that rumbles up the battlefield in the style of a traditional vertical shooter. Your tank can face and fire in 8 directions, but you have to play economically, as it carries limited ammunition and fuel, which you need to top off by collecting refill icons along the way. All of this while avoiding a variety of different battlefield hazards. Enemy tanks, bunker emplacements, little soldiers who stupidly rush at you on foot, and bombs falling from overhead. Your tank moves pretty sluggishly, and anything that hits you will not get fully out of commission. Yes, even the tiny little bullets fired by the stupid foot soldiers. That makes for a tough game. It gets even harder once the stage counter rolls over to indicate you're on level 2, since twice as many enemies appear as before, while new elements like rocket silos and enemy fortresses enter the mix. Based on YouTube footage, it appears that Tank Command contains 3 stages, and the game has a definitive ending in which you rumble your tank up to a flag finis. However, this may be some sort of deepfake psyop, because I refuse to believe that an actual human being could survive level 2, let alone 3. And more to the point, I have trouble imagining that anyone could feel compelled to make the effort to do so. The 7800 was a capable machine, but you wouldn't know it from Tank Command, an ugly, shrill mess that lacks any of the niceties of contemporary titles, like visible breaks between levels, any sort of visual variety whatsoever, friendly controls, or compelling objectives. But then, what do you expect from Froggo Games? What even is Froggo Games? Even the dedicated Atari fan and distributor community doesn't really know anything about Froggo Games. There are no firm details about the company in any of the usual online resources like Atari Age, and the forums there and similar places like Atari.io can only offer conjecture, rumor, and deductive guesses. Froggo appears to have been a company established in 1987 or so in order to exploit the Atari resurgence that took place that year as retailers sought to capitalize on the NES's popularity. In fact, Froggo seems to be the first entity of its type, a new company in the latter 80s dedicated entirely to the Atari market. Most of Froggo's releases shipped for 2600, and of those only one, Spider Droid, was actually a new game. Their other releases simply repackaged older Atari titles like Karate and Seahawk, and there's some debate over whether these were properly licensed reissues or if Froggo simply dealt in professional-looking bootlegs. And I do mean professional-looking. If Froggo deserves any sort of praise, it's that their packaging stood out on shelves. They took a Master System-style approach to box design, titles displayed in massive Roman serif type, accompanied by a single icon-like illustration. On shelves, their games looked more like productivity software than games. I'm not sure that the simple icon on white look necessarily screamed "buy me" to kids playing video games in that era, but at least it had a vibe. That look extended to their 7800 releases, Tank Command and Water Ski. The stark visuals, which suggested spreadsheets more than arcade-style action, probably account for why these games sold so poorly and have become so expensive after the fact. Although it probably didn't help that Froggo Games remains shrouded in mystery and anonymity. Was Froggo a one-man shop, some kind of exploitative bootlegger, or even a false front by Atari? No one knows, but all of these possibilities have been put out by observers. The Atari.io thread from a few years back, which includes commentary and speculation by people who were actually in the business at the time, including the proprietor of the famous AtariSales.com, creates the impression that it was really just a solo enterprise by someone who genuinely wanted to make games for Atari consoles, but received less than zero support from Atari Corp, and lacked the manpower to run a proper business, let alone make proper games. And so we have the curio that is Tank Command, a game that reminds me of Pachinko and Space Slalom for SG-1000. Agonizingly hard to come by, frightfully expensive when you do, and packed with half-finished game code that absolutely does not justify the price you paid for it. Honestly, as poorly as Atari Corp mishandled the 7800, it's a miracle the system didn't end up playing host to a whole lot more of these disasters. And now we have Impossible Mission, a game that's kind of literal in this incarnation due to it being a poor port of a classic work. Now, even if you don't know the Atari or microcomputer worlds of the 80s and grew up entirely in a bubble of Japanese systems like Nintendo and Sega, you still know Impossible Mission because Zillion for Sega Master System is straight up a direct clone of this game. The 7800 version of Impossible Mission is a disaster for entirely different reasons than Tank Command is a disaster. Where Tank Command plays like an unfinished sketch of a good idea, Impossible Mission plays like no one actually took the time to test it before shipping. On the surface, it seems totally fine. Impossible Mission was a true microcomputer classic from the mid-80s, a console-style action game designed for computers following the Atari crash. Epyx took advantage of the more luxurious tech afforded by computers versus the consoles at the time to create a work that landed somewhere between a platformer and a puzzle game. Players needed to make their way through an elaborate military-industrial complex armed only with a portable computer and the ability to perform an acrobatic leap. In order to navigate the enemy base, the hero has to collect computer codes and assemble puzzles that they can input at mainframes in order to prevent a villain from launching a missile to wreak havoc on a civilian populace that probably doesn't deserve nuking. In order to acquire all of these fragments, you need to visit all the rooms throughout the complex and search every available object to uncover codes. Not just computer terminals, but also things like desks, trash bins, sofa cushions, even toilets. This is difficult because, unlike in Sega's Impossible Mission knockoff Zillion, your little jumping guy doesn't wield the most powerful gun of the solar system, or in fact, any weapon whatsoever. Deadly robot guards patrol every room, each possessing different behaviors, but every last one capable of killing unarmed intruders at a single touch. Most robots simply patrol a single platform and react when you cross their line of sight. These reactions usually amount to dashing at you when they spot you, or zapping you with a beam of electricity. There are occasional bad guys who prefer to seek and destroy, actively drifting toward you regardless of where you stand. In any case, all you can do is flip your way to safety. The challenge mainly comes from two factors: search time and randomization. In order to hunt for codes and puzzle pieces, you need to search everything in sight. However, it takes a few seconds to search an object. An Impossible Mission might actually contain the first instance of a progressive action status bar in video games. Where would Assassin's Creed be without Impossible Mission? I ask you. While that search status bar ticks down, you need to stand immobile at the site you're pilfering. The robots, however, do not stand still, which leaves you vulnerable to their patrol routines. So you often need to break from your search in order to evade a robot, then continue once you break line of sight, and it returns to its neutral state. Thankfully, your search progress status carries over when you break contact, but even so, some situations involve deft acrobatics in order to avoid getting wrecked by a robot and resetting the room. It's pretty unforgiving. The other factor that comes into play is the randomization. The alien base consists of elevator shafts and room nodes branching off, and the arrangement of rooms and placement of objects and enemies within those rooms resets with every new session you begin. So you can't simply memorize the critical path, and it's entirely possible for one playthrough to generate a far more challenging seed than the last. It keeps your little jumping guy with the weird-looking run cycle, let's call him, say, Cruise Tom for no particular reason, on his toes. Some layouts can be breezy to complete, while others can dump you into arrangements where the first few rooms appear almost impossible, like it says on the box. The overall structure of the game does work to your favor. You have unlimited lives in which to complete the quest, with each failure subtracting 10 minutes from the 6-hour time limit you're allowed before the bad guy launches his missile. And while the enemy base has a different layout every time you play, it's always procedurally generated to obey certain rules, one of which is that you can skip rooms and return to them later. You can then solve puzzles elsewhere which reward you with special limited perks, either the ability to put all robots in a room to sleep, or the ability to reset the location of platforms in a room. The former feature becomes almost mandatory in certain layouts where you otherwise would have too little space or time in which to search specific items, or where hunter-seeker robots would prevent you from making any progress. It's a truly groundbreaking action game that incorporates structured randomization into its design in a fairly unprecedented way. Before this, you could find it in a handful of computer RPGs like Beneath Apple Manor and, of course, Rogue. Impossible Mission made its computer debut in 1984 alongside a couple of other action-style games, Rescue and Fractalis, and Elite, both of which used randomized values to generate worlds to travel, shoot, and trade through from a first-person perspective. Of course, Epyx's game bore no resemblance to those works, looking more like Lode Runner, Pitfall, or Elevator Action, and laying the groundwork for exploratory action games and procedurally generated platform action games, though it would take about a quarter of a century for someone to fully deliver on that latter concept. Despite its groundbreaking nature, its great popularity among computer gamers, and its crisp, console-friendly design, Impossible Mission only showed up on a single console in the US prior to its remake for WiiWare a couple of decades later. And this is that sole console release. And that makes it all the more disappointing that Epyx biffed this release. Well, okay, not Epyx. Despite their close ties with Atari at this point, I assume they were neck deep in Link's development and struggling to hit the moving target milestones Jack Tramiel kept laying down in an attempt to put the squeeze on the publisher and perform a hostile takeover of their assets. So instead, they outsourced this port to Man Development Corp, according to the title screen. I have no idea what Man Development Corp was, though, because the only two games credited to them on Moby Games appear to have actually been developed by Computer Magic, who also handled the 7800 ports of Epyx's summer and winter games, as well as One-on-One. Maybe Man Development was a sort of temp agency that dished out assignments for subcontractors to handle. Or maybe I should say mishandle. Impossible Mission, which I should stress has nothing to do with the television series Mission Impossible and you should feel bad for even suggesting otherwise, looks and plays well on 7800. The console does a fine job of recreating the feel and appearance of Impossible Mission's computer versions, with slightly more sedate and less eye-watering colors than it had on Commodore 64. But this port of Impossible Mission has become infamous for literally being impossible to finish, due to a bug that prevents players from being able to collect all of the visual codes they need to assemble in order to stop the missile launch and win the game. I feel like that's the sort of thing a developer would have figured out if they had assigned even a single playtester to spend a few days with the game and run it through its paces, but who knows? Maybe the wrong program code version ended up being committed to cartridge, or more likely, Atari Corp's mercenary approach to its console business meant that Computer Magic literally had no time or budget to hit their deadline. Ultimately, I'd put the blame for this version at the feet of Atari as the publisher, since they're the ones who would have determined things like budgets, deadlines, and lot checks. And Computer Magic otherwise did pretty good work on the 7800, as opposed to Atari Corp, who published a lot of solid material in the latter half of the 80s, in spite of themselves. In any case, caring hackers and modders have created patches that fix up this version of the game for anyone who wants to experience Impossible Mission on 7800 from start to finish, despite Atari's best lack of efforts. So, for those of you running emulators, or even real hardware with a gadget like the 7800 GameDrive by RetroHQ, Impossible Mission isn't actually as impossible these days as its name and reputation would suggest. And speaking of which, special thanks this episode, and in future episodes, to Stone Age Gamer for setting me up with a GameDrive so that I can capture the remainder of the 7800 video side series from an actual console and RGB. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, the late 80s Atari saga gets even messier. Thanks for nothing, Jack.